Hello, and welcome to J Hutch Talks Too Much. My name is Jesse, and today we are going to be talking about the election that's coming up. So this is we're in Canada, and if I have any viewers who happen to be American, you might be surprised to find out that on I think it was August 15th, the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau called for a snap election, and we'll be voting for our next Prime Minister on September 20th. And before you ask, that is September 20th of this year, not any other potential year. So, yeah, that's an election that is going to be coming up very, very soon. So, as you can tell from the title, my topic is why I don't vote with my heart. I do want to kind of preface this right off the bat by saying a few things. One, I'm going to be maybe reading a little bit more in today's discussion than I normally do. Partly it's because I wanted to, initially I was going to show you some clips from different people, but I'm a bit worried about getting dinged for copyright. So rather than show the clips or play the audio of clips, depending on where you're listening to this, I am, for the most part, just going to read the quotes out directly. So I've written a lot of stuff down. So that's one sort of thing that I want to just get out of the way, first of all. The second point that I want to make is to kind of maybe align myself a little bit politically here, because, when you say, why I don't vote with my heart, it perhaps suggests that you are a certain kind of political person, or it aligns you with a particular kind of ideology. So I will say, in terms of the Canadian political parties, that I'm not conservative and I'm not liberal. And so if you're, on the left, I'm sure that whatever arguments that you want to raise about either of those parties and the ideologies behind them, there's a good chance that I'm probably in full agreement. So with that in mind, I'm sure I've probably just alienated a good part of the people who are listening to this. But one of the things that I do want to do with the political videos that I put up is really kind of sort of open up a fairly large tent to discuss a variety of ideas and a variety of perspectives. And one of the main issues that I see at work right now is that politics is very tribalistic. People largely kind of listen to what their own group says and is not interested in listening to what other groups are saying. And that's not really the intention of this particular discussion. And with that in mind, what I'm about to say is probably going to alienate everybody else. But again, what I'm about to talk about is largely about tactics. It's a tactical issue. And I do think that if you're on the left, and I sort of consider myself to be on the left, that there should be at least a lot of room for tactical discussions. And one thing that I am very sort of nervous about is the kind of infighting that goes on within the left. And I think certainly in the United States right now, we're seeing examples of sort of the splintering of the left, really in the wake of Bernie Sanders, which is not really, I think, a particularly good outcome of any of that. So, what I'm about to say could very well be in disagreement with a good amount of people out there. But I do want to suggest that it's more about advancing a conversation or pushing forward a conversation than about advancing or enhancing any kind of infighting. And while I do think that this conversation makes sense to a wide variety of people with a wide variety of beliefs and ideologies. I do think that largely what I'm about to say is kind of directed at least towards activists, activist culture, or those who are activist minded. What I mean by activist minded is that they may not participate in what I kind of consider activism to be, but they share a kind of politics that are key to activism. And again, as a kind of an omission, I feel like I am myself more activist minded than I am an activist. But it strikes me that those who are activist minded have a perspective at the moment on voting that strikes me as being quite odd. And mostly this centers around the idea of voting with your heart as something that is good and noble, a noble political gesture. And I don't really agree with that. And that's not to say that the people who are voting with their hearts are not good and noble themselves, but rather that this kind of emphasis placed on voting speaks to a general misunderstanding of politics. To give an example, there is an activist-minded person who I follow on Twitter. I don't know them personally, but they're a fairly significant and active figure on Twitter. A Canadian figure, has a lot of followers, tweets quite a lot. And just recently, he tweeted out the following. He said, "I can't recall ever being as demotivated to vote as I am now." He says, "The Liberals never lose in my riding. The NDP has given up on it, and there's no socialist or communist party candidate. Dispiriting." It was the ending of it. Now, in many ways, I'm guessing that if I sat down and talked with this person, that we would be very much aligned politically. And I do think that within that tweet, they do make a point when they say that, it's not something I really disagree with. It would be nice to be able to vote for someone with whom you are not only ideologically aligned, but somebody who ultimately has a chance of winning. But I'm also kind of on board with an element of the tweet where it seems, at least on some level, that they might be actually thinking about not voting. Now, nevertheless, with those kind of agreements set in, I do think his overall perspective speaks to me about the problem that I am discussing, where there is this kind of real unnecessary emphasis that is placed on voting. So what do I mean by this? Well, in order to really explain it, I want to quote from a couple of people. The first quote is quite short. The second one is quite long. So just bear with me as I discuss these different quotes. Okay, so the first one, if you've watched the first 4 videos, you'll know that in almost every single one of them, I've talked about Noam Chomsky, and this video is not going to be an exception to that. So years ago, I mean, not that long ago in the overall history, historical arc, historical narrative of Noam Chomsky, I would guess that this video, or this conference rather, was, I don't know, 2014, 2015, maybe a little bit before that, maybe 2012 or something along those lines. But in that particular time period, I think he's maybe giving a talk at a university, and it's in England. And somebody stands up in the crowd and says, "Do you vote? And would you advise someone in the UK to vote?" So the question is important because it's not just about whether or not Chomsky votes, but it's about whether or not he would advise someone outside of the United States system to vote. And the reason why I say that there's a difference there is because, the United States system is very, very specific. And it usually just comes down to these kind of 2 very specific figures. Now in England, it also generally comes down to 2 very specific figures, as often it does in Canada as well. But nevertheless, they're different kind of electoral systems. And we'll talk a little bit about that with regards to Canada a little bit later. But this is what Chomsky says this is how he answers the question. He says, "It's a decision, but it's the kind of decision that's 10th order. Okay, it's the kind of voting is a decision, and the kind of decision that's 10th order and should be made in 5 minutes. Sometimes, he says, sometimes there's a point in voting. There could be worse and less worse, and it could make a difference. Most of the time, it's a very small decision. You have to compare the alternatives and see if there's on balance any difference. But it doesn't seem to be a fundamental question. Now, this is an interesting quotation in light of other things that Chomsky says, because often when he's asked in America, how he feels about the candidates in American elections, he's very clear that he thinks that the population should vote Democrat to prevent a Republican president from winning. If you go back to the 2000 election or 2004, back when I was really first starting to follow him, he generally talks about how if you're in a swing state, then it's important to vote strategically. If you're not in a swing state, then it doesn't really matter how you vote. He talks about how I remember him talking about how he lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and so he would vote green because it's not a swing state. But nevertheless, lately he's become a bit more hardline about that for specific reasons, but reasons that I'm not going to get into now. But overall, his point is, that whether or not you vote, it's a decision, but it's a 10th order decision and should be made in 5 minutes. Okay, so why does he say this? Well, in order to answer that question, I'm going to quote somebody else. I'm going to quote a friend of Noam Chomsky's. I'm going to quote Norman Finkelstein, who is another scholar. And Finkelstein, this is a longer quote, but he says this. He says, and I think that this is really crucial to understanding Chomsky's point, as well as understanding the point that I'm going to make about why I don't vote with my heart. He says, most people in the world know there's something really wrong with the system, that there are too few people who are getting too much and too many people who are getting too little. And there's all sorts of problems, environment, health, that need to be solved. And under the current system, they're not being solved. And there's no hope of them being solved. Most people know that, he said. The challenge, he says, is the one that Gandhi always talked about. How do you get people to act on what they already know is wrong? You don't have to educate them, he says, because they already know. You don't have to educate them. You don't have to enlighten them. They already know that there's a big problem, but they don't do anything about them. So it's not a question, he says, and I've edited a few things. Out of here, you can go, and if you want, I can send you the actual video. He says it's not a question. I'll put it in the little thing below of where the original quote comes from. He says it's not a question of changing the method of dissent. I think it's finding the right tactics and the right goal that will get people to act. You have to set a goal that makes sense to people. If you set the goal too far, you lose them. When they chanted, "We are the 99%, every American understood that. But if the movement at the beginning, and here he's talking about the Occupy movement, if the movement at the beginning said, nationalize the banks, and then he says as an aside, of course, I think banks should be nationalized. That's Finkelstein's point. He says, but if they said that at the beginning, nationalize the banks, even though I agree with it, you wouldn't have gotten a reaction from people. They're not there, he says. You can't go beyond where people are. You just lose them. So he says, you have to find the maximum point of reaching people. So that's important, right? It's not just about finding out exactly what people believe, the standard thing that they believe, and just tell that to them. But you find out what is the maximum that you can essentially get away with saying, right? You have to find the maximum point of reaching people. And he says, but you have to be careful about not going beyond, because then you just become a cult. You're no longer involved in politics. He comes back to this cult thing later, so I'll talk a little bit more about that then. The problem is, he says, and this is where he provides a kind of solution. Here's what we do. He says, we have to sink deep roots among the people, understand them, see how far you can take them, how far they are willing to go, and figuring out tactics that will finally shake people up enough that they say, you know what? I'm going out into the streets. I've had it. He says, I don't think it requires great, profound thought. It requires hard work and personal sacrifice, a willingness to do the dirty work. And he says, we do not set the goal. We do not set the goal. It's public consciousness that sets the limit of the goal, right? When he says we do not set the goal, he means he's referring to activists. We do not set the goal. Public consciousness determines the limit of the goal. We have to see where people are at, not where we are at. If it's just about us, if it's not about politics, it's about a cult, right? And when you're in a cult, you can set whatever goal you want. And what that largely means is if you're only in a group of people who think exactly the same way as you, if you have no interest whatsoever in broadening your group to a broad public, in taking your politics to a broad public, then you can say whatever you want because everybody in the group is going to agree with you. Nationalize the banks, everybody cheers. But as soon as you take it beyond that, you lose them. So if you're only interested in being a cult, then you don't care about those kind of questions. But if you are interested in politics, then you do care about those kinds of questions. He goes on to say, in a cult, everything becomes personal. And this is what Finkelstein says. Finkelstein says, I, meaning Finkelstein, support the abolition of money. But so what? The world is facing an economic crisis, he says, and they ask, what do you think we should do? And I say, eliminate money. And then he says, well, what does that have to do with anything? That's not on the political agenda. And he says, that's what the problem is with all of these discussions. It's always about, what do you think? Where do you stand? He says, I think that the major challenge is to reorient the way we think about politics. That's, again, another crucial sentence because he's essentially saying the way we tend to think about politics is wrong and largely unhelpful. And often the way we tend to think about it is in this within this personal dimension. What do you think? What do I think? Where do I stand? How can I express myself in this moment? He goes on to say, it's not about us. Politics has to be about reaching masses of people. Otherwise, it's not politics. Okay, so Finkelstein is not talking about voting here, but I do think his point does demonstrate why Chomsky says that voting is a 10th order decision. So let's take a direct example, okay? Suppose you believe with all your heart in the platform of a particular political party here in Canada. This is strictly going to be a hypothetical example, right? Suppose all the polls in your riding, meaning just in your particular riding, not the national polls, you can get those local ridings. Suppose your local polls have your party that you believe in showing at about 13% support. You know, maybe it oscillates. Maybe some days it's 11, maybe some days it's 15, but roughly the average is about 13%. And on the federal level, you know, if you look into it enough, you can kind of see that they're poised to win 7, maybe 8 seats. Okay, this is a very hypothetical situation because I'm not entirely sure this would describe any of the major parties that are running right now. So, okay, so in your local community, in your riding, they're polling at about 13%. They're poised to win 7, 8 seats nationally. And on election day, you decide, I'm going to vote with my heart, and I'm going to vote for that party. Well, if you agree with Finkelstein, that action might be many things, and they might be many good things. But one thing that it's not is a political act. And as an aside, nor is it an act, I don't think, maybe somebody could make the case, but nor is it an act that will probably make an impact on the material conditions of people's lives. It is akin to making your slogan, nationalize the banks or eliminate money. You are not speaking to where the public is at. So, okay. If you shouldn't do that, what should we be doing instead of that? Well, go back to Finkelstein, right? If your goal is to get enough MPs of your political party, of your preferred political party in power, so that they can actually have some impact on our material conditions. Maybe it is as the party of majority, maybe it's as a minority party. If that is your goal, and I will say, I'm not convinced that activists should be setting as a central goal anyways, getting a particular political party into power. It's not a goal that I don't think they shouldn't pursue at all, but nevertheless, I don't think it's really the ultimate goal, I don't think at least it should be the ultimate goal that activists choose. Okay, so if that is your goal, though, to get enough of your MPs of your preferred party into power, so that they can actually have an impact on people's lives, then you have to use Finkelstein's terms, have a willingness to do the dirty work. And doing the dirty work does not mean voting for your heart for a party with 13% support. And it doesn't mean 2-3 weeks before an election making posts on social media about what party you're intending to vote for, or why it would be silly to vote for another party, or any of those kinds of things, right? It means the day after the last election took place, the last one, that you sink deep roots among the people, understand them, see how far you can take them. Here I'm quoting Finkelstein, how far they are willing to go, and figure out tactics that will finally shake people up, so that by the time the next election rolls around, your party actually has a chance of making a genuine impact. And you'd probably very right to say, I would absolutely agree with you if you said this, that sounds like a lot of work. Well, yeah, it is a lot of work. And that's precisely why Chomsky says voting is a 10th order decision that should be made in 5 minutes. You spend your 5 minutes doing that, he says, and then in other interviews, he'll say, and then you go back to the real work. Because for him, the real serious activism is in that kind of hard work that Norman Finkelstein is talking about. And so when you get to that election, that election period, and the party you want to win is still polling at 13%, then you look at your options and see what's possible and make a decision. And part of that decision, I think, will have to come down to saying, out of the options that are available, what options will best help me achieve my long-term goal? And I'm not outright making a case for strategic voting here. I think that there are plenty of times where it makes sense to vote for the party you want, if you have concluded that it is a good tactic to help you achieve your goals. But with that in mind, it might also be the case with an election where you're in a situation where your options are quite limited. Even in Canada, where we have 4 major parties in most of the country, but there are ridings where it's just a fact that it comes down to 2 parties quite often. And if your goal, and by the way, I should say, yes, I mean, I think that if you support one of those, if you're looking at the polls in your local community and you see that your party that you really like is in 3rd place, 4th place, and you really kind of want to, if you see a possibility of ramping them up before the election takes place so that they are a contender, I think that that's the right move. And I think that's certainly what you should be doing. And it should be noted that we're still 20 days away from an election, which in an American year, that's a blink of an eye, but in a Canadian year, that's a little bit slower. You do want to kind of keep those things in mind. But as I say, quite often there are ridings where you get to a few days before the election, and it is ultimately down to 2 parties. And suppose your goal is to bring about a more equitable society with stronger environmental policies. You may have to ask the question, not the question, what party out of these 2 are available are going to be the ones more likely to enact the policies that I like, because it's quite possible that neither of them will, right? That's certainly a possibility. But you might want to ask yourself the question, and I think it's an important question to ask, will it be easier for me to continue to work at achieving my goals if one party is in power over another, right? Would it be easier for me to continue to work at achieving my goals, maybe not within the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but somewhere down the line? Will it be easier for me to continue to do this work, this hard work that Finkelstein describes, if one party is in power over the other? If one party is going to constantly be a distraction away from your ultimate goals, then I think you do have to kind of consider that as a significant question. To give another example of this, many on the left, and I am one of them, don't like the first past the post system, right? And in fact, many of us are critical of the fact that our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, essentially ran his first campaign in part on reforming that system, and then he went on very quickly to break that promise. And I'm very much in agreement with those criticisms of Trudeau, and I do believe that the first past the post system should be eliminated and replaced. Now, with that in mind, many who advocate in favor of reforming the system advocate another system in its place, which typically speaking that I'm seeing often is a ranked ballot system. And I would also agree that that is a better system. But now I'm going to make a bold, out there statement like the one that Finkelstein says when he says, I'm in favor of nationalizing the banks, I'm in favor of eliminating money. I'll make a out there statement as well. But again, and I'm actually not going to spend today's video really justifying this statement, but maybe future videos I will. And I do want to say that I recognize that this is very much a total left field out there statement, but I think largely it's an out there left field statement because of a lot of misconceptions that people have when they hear this. So I, like Noam Chomsky, who I quoted, believe largely essentially in an anarcho-syndicalist system as an ultimate ideal. That's anarcho-syndicalist, you can look it up. But as Chomsky points out in an article from, I think, the 1970s, he says representative democracy would be criticized by a traditional anarchist. Representative democracy would be criticized by a traditional anarchist. Now, why is that? Well, Peter Kropotkin, a very early anarchist, says that in representative democratic systems, and here I'm quoting, the delegation of power leads to the elected officials becoming isolated from and beyond the control of the mass of people who elected them. An anarchist society, conversely, would make decisions by means of congresses composed of delegates who discuss among themselves and submit proposals, not laws, to their constituents, meaning the public. And so the system is based on self-government, not representative government. So, okay, that happens to be, a genuine anarchist is not going to say this is what the future should look like. This is my vision of the future, because that's imposing a certain kind of authority and power that anarchists ultimately reject. But the kind of thing that Kropotkin is suggesting, I wouldn't say is the ultimate option, but sounds like a pretty good option, and I'm not necessarily saying it should necessarily appeal to you right now. I think that ultimately that is akin to saying nationalize the banks and eliminate money. So I'm fully aware of that. And I certainly don't think that it's the kind of system that's really going to happen in my lifetime. But nevertheless, from my perspective, and I would imagine the perspective of Chomsky and of Kropotkin and of many others, you can go through the list, Bakunin, Rudolf Rocker, all these people, the ranked ballot system is more ideal than the first past the post system. But as an alternative, it's still an example of a representative government system, and therefore is not the ultimate ideal, right? Ultimately, we would still have some significant and serious objections to it. Nevertheless, if there was a vote tomorrow, and the three options, again, are really crazy hypothetical, but suppose this was the case, that there was a vote tomorrow, right? With the public mindset being what it will be tomorrow, which I would assume is going to be quite similar to what it's like today. And the three options on the ballot are keep first past the post, replace first past the post with a ranked ballot system, or eliminate representative democracy in Canada. Would I even consider voting for the last one, even though that is more my perspective? Would I vote for that? I absolutely wouldn't. There's no meaningful public support for that option whatsoever. That vote wouldn't help me achieve any goal, I don't think, that I have. All right, so I'm just going to take a little drink of my drink here. So you might reasonably say, look, if people just voted with their hearts, we wouldn't have to be stuck with all this kind of strategy, tactics, and all that kind of stuff. And that might be true, right? So you do hear this coming from often from the left, right? The sort of non-liberal left voter who will say, if people were like me and voted with their hearts, then we'd be fine. The party that I want to be in power, the party that they want to be in power, they would be in power. Now, that may very well actually be true. But the only thing that actually demonstrates to me is exactly what Finkelstein says, that most people already know there's something wrong with the system. But the actual challenge is to get them to act, right? When you say if everybody voted with their heart, we wouldn't have this problem, you're acknowledging Finkelstein's point, right? That most people already know that there's something wrong with the system. But there's that other part of it that's important. The challenge is to get them to act. And if you're activists, then that is something that's on us to some degree, right? That's the work that we're supposed to be doing. And so if people in their hearts would vote for these parties, but when it comes to election time, they're not, that is in part a failure of the activist community. And I actually don't mean that in a particularly critical way, because as I've said, it's very, very, very hard work. And those people out there who have surely done far more activist work than I ever have, and will probably have done more activist work in the last couple months than I've done in my life, they will tell you surely that there are a lot of failures along the way, right? That's just part of what it's all about, right? But the point is to recognize what the real work is, and it's not voting. That is, to use Chomsky's term, a 10th order decision. And so when people say things like, I could never bring myself to vote unless it's for somebody or something that I entirely agree with, that's just romanticizing voting way too much, right? And I can understand why people do that, because as we've said, it's not easy to do actual political work, right? I admit it, I do almost none of it myself. This conversation that we're having right now is pretty much the extent of it. So, certainly you can be critical of that, right? It's hard. Most people in the world can't do it, right? They've got far too many concerns. They're working 3 jobs. They're, raising a family. They're doing a lot of difficult work, right? They don't have the time, the energy, the means to devote to that political work. And so in the absence of that, when we recognize, it's 2 weeks before an election, it's 3 weeks before an election, and the work hasn't been done that is required so that the party of our heart has much of a chance of, making a political impact. We do the one thing that we think is the right thing, which is to vote with our hearts. But really, it's a mistake to set voting a political party in power as a goal in the first place, right? As Finkelstein says, the public consciousness determines what the goals are. See what is the most that you can get away with by setting as a goal, and then determine what your tactics are that can go about achieving that goal. And we should really just see voting as but one very small tactic that could help us achieve a goal. If you have no goals, then I'm not sure I see the point in voting, right? If you don't think that voting can help you on your path towards achieving your goals at all, then I don't think it's unreasonable to decide not to vote, right? And that brings me back to the quote that I read from the very beginning, and I'll read it again. I can't recall ever being as demotivated to vote as I am now. The Liberals never lose in my riding. The NDP has given up on it, and there's no Socialist or Communist Party candidate. Dispiriting. So while I noted that I was sympathetic to this tweet, I would still have to ask this person, if there were a Socialist or Communist Party candidate running, how would voting for them be a tactic to advance a goal in a way that is different from not voting at all? Again, it strikes me that this simply comes back to what Finkelstein says, where people misconceive politics as being about, what do I believe? What can I show myself and others what I believe? What statement can I make that shows you where I'm at, right? And I feel like the answer is to the experience that this person is experiencing is not to be dispirited by the lack of choices, though I can certainly understand that, the situation can be frequently dispiriting. But one really needs to do the opposite, which is to be motivated when you're in this situation and you see, okay, Liberals never lose in my riding. The NDP has given up on it. There's no Socialist or Communist Party candidate running. Well, that in many ways should be motivation, right? Motivation to do the hard work that will make those options viable in the long run, right? Which again is hard because in a political system which is geared towards privileging what do you think, right? You're basically saying, what can I do not for me, but maybe for the next generation? What can I do potentially for a world that I might not even live in, right? That's a hard thing because there's a certain aspect of politics right now that reminds me of sort of fundamentalist religion. You know how when there's this imagination of the end times, and if you talk to a fundamentalist, they'll say, many of them will say, not all of them, I don't want to speak in broad generalizations, but many of them will say that they believe that the end times, let's say, as described in the book of Revelations, is going to happen in their lifetime. Because it's important for them to see that, right? This is a big part of the narrative, right? This is something that they believe and they want to see it happen, right? To their fullest extent. So the revelation has to happen in my lifetime. Well, I think a lot of people invested in politics believe the same thing, right? This needs to happen in my lifetime, which I can understand because there's a lot of very serious concerns. There's a lot of people suffering. There are a lot of people in pain. So you want to end that, right? But really, ultimately, these changes come very, very slowly. So again, this is not to say vote strategically or don't vote or anything, but rather stop putting so much emphasis on voting as such an important thing. It's one of many tactics and ultimately a less important tactic than many others that you could use to try to achieve these long-term goals that will help people in the way that you want to help people. And if you are voting with your heart because you don't see your vote as being able to achieve a goal, in other words, if you're the kind of person who says to yourself, it doesn't matter who or what I vote for, so, I might as well just vote for what's in my heart. Nothing I can do could change anything anyway. There's nothing that could possibly change. So I might as well just vote for my heart. Well, with my heart. Well, if that's your thinking, I really don't think that's a persuasive point in favor of the vote with your heart movement. Vote with your heart because nothing really matters. I don't think that that's really the best point that one can make. But insofar as you do have political goals at all, and that could mean a range of goals. It could mean something like improving climate policies. improving the material conditions of working people, of poor people, of marginalized people, then you want to consider your vote as one of many possible tactics, and a small one on the road to achieving those goals. It could be that voting for the party you want to win is a good tactic that might help you achieve your goal. But if it won't, I don't see what the point is. Like all tactics in politics, and this just brings me back to the Finkelstein point, the question should not be, what will be the tactic that makes me feel good about myself? But rather, what will be the tactic that will best help me achieve the goals that are set by public consciousness? And those are all my thoughts. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I will add those 2 videos that I have liberally quoted from in the description below. If you like this video, please consider liking this video. And if you haven't subscribed to, let's see, one of our viewers says, I voted for my heart, but it rejected the position. I might be in medical distress. We will send somebody for you as soon as possible. So thank you for that. I didn't realize we would have an emergency situation in our hands here, folks. So, but if you haven't subscribed yet, and you can subscribe, and you're interested in subscribing, please subscribe. And otherwise, as I say, I'm not particularly interested in having left infighting. I'm more interested in having a conversation about tactics. So if that's something you want to have, please feel free to let me know. If you want to talk about it here on the channel, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you as well. So thanks so much for watching. I appreciate it. And we'll next week, I should say, before I close up shop here, next week, I believe we will finally be getting to the Iliad. There is a copy of it that's one of my playlists on YouTube, so have a look for that. That's the one that I will be, that's the one I'm reading, and it's the one that I will be referring to in that discussion. So yeah, so that is coming up, I think, with all luck next week. And I will see you then. So take care. Thanks for watching, and have a good night. Bye-bye.